Welcome to Zcast, everybody. I'm Zeus Caravallo from ZK Research, and I'll be your host today. And I'm here for another one of my thought leadership videos. And I'm joined today by Dave Ginsburg, who's the VP of Solutions and Product Marketing at Aryaka, who is actually one of the SD-WAN pioneers. Before we get started, though, I do want to thank my media partner, eWeek. Zcasts are done in conjunction with the eWeek eSpeaks program, so thanks to eWeek. Before we get started, though, I do want to just talk a little bit about why we're doing this. I think the SD-WAN and SASE industries have evolved maybe faster than I've ever seen any network technology evolve in the 20, 30, 40 years I've been involved in networking. It's we've had a fusion of the two, which historically they were, I think, thought of as separate markets, but obviously with the shift of hybrid work coming, the big pivot from on-prem to cloud, these things have been driven together. In fact, I think a lot of the rapid evolution has just been driven by the shift in compute. And it's been my thesis for years that network evolution tends to follow compute evolution. And we had all of our workers, apps, and data located in corporate offices and corporate data centers. We needed a certain type of network to connect them, and that's the traditional hub and spoke. Now that our workers, apps, and data are located in the cloud, we need a different type of network. So just conceptually, it's easy to understand that you can't run a cloud-first business on a network that was designed for a different era. So Dave, just why don't you say a quick hello and introduce yourself, and just give us a brief background on Aryaka.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me join you today. Much appreciated. And just as a review for those not as familiar with Aryaka, and interestingly, we're sometimes told by people we're one of the best kept secrets in the industry. We're about 12 years old now. We offer a fully managed networking and security service globally. Fully managed or co-managed, in fact, is the watchword, in that it's an OpEx model. You don't have to train your IT team. You just de-risk your deployments. As part of the management model, as you mentioned earlier, that there's the cloud and what people sometimes call the cloud consumption model. Fast forward, it's what we sometimes call the network consumption model, where you're consuming networking as a service. And as we begin to talk about the evolution of SD-WAN and SASE, you'll see that this whole concept of networking as a service and networking security as a service dovetails very well into an architecture that we've built up over time that delivers connectivity, delivers optimization, delivers multi-cloud on-ramps, multi-cloud connectivity, delivers obviously visibility and global orchestration.
Yeah, in fact, I find I'm thrilled to have you personally, because I've known you for a long time, Dave, and we have a pretty long history in the whole concept of cloud-based security, all the way back to products like Shasta and Allegra and things like that. And
whoa, that's the distant past.
Well, it's interesting, though, that there's people, I think buyers have wanted an easier way to deploy security for a long time. Those platforms, I think, were a little ahead of their time. They weren't really, software driven, but I think the demand has been there. And now finally with software-defined networking, we have that. Now, for those people that are less familiar with Aryaka, though, you mentioned you've been around 12 years. You're one of the best kept secrets in SD-WAN. There's lots and lots of SD-WAN and SASE vendors, which I think creates a lot of confusion for buyers. I get a lot of questions of what's the difference between this one and this one. So real quickly, what are some of Aryaka's differentiations?
Sure. And as you said, there's a lot of posturing. There's really a lot of disinformation in terms of what's required to offer a true managed networking and security service. How do you fuse that together? And so one of our basic foundational precepts is you can't ignore the network. And it's not only from Aryaka coming originally from our networking pedigree, but it's also, you've got to have the connectivity. You've got to have, the application performance. You've got to be able to reach into the different continents. And you can't just do this, deploying a couple or a bunch of security instances at the edge of the cloud and saying, okay, it's up to your own to figure out how to interconnect this. And so one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is this global network, is this managed middle mile that has 5.9 plus SLAs that we can really tell our leading enterprise customers that, yes, they're going to have this LAN-like application experience across the globe. And so that harkens back, if you look at the definition of SASE, it's not just network security as a service, it's network as a service and network security as a service. And based on our over decades of experience in the networking side, we can then bring on to our foundation, our services POPs, our curated middle mile, our own middle mile architecture. We can bring on those cloud edge security capabilities that people call SASE. So,
yeah, in fact, I think when I think of the world of SASE and SD-WAN, it does involve both security and networking. And so when if you're watching this video and you're thinking about who you want to use for a vendor, there's lots of security vendors that I would say have a big S and little n. And then there's lots of network vendors that I would think is, big N and little s. But I think Aryaka has a competency in both, and I think that's really important. So, I know another kind of interesting aspect to you is you do go to market with a fully managed service, and I think that obviously helps reduce a lot of the complexity with SD-WAN. But I'm curious as to what you think some of the foundations of your managed offer are, and how do you see the overlap of SD-WAN and SASE? And so, I think an easy way to think, is SASE a feature of SD-WAN, or, I think there's lots of confusion, as you mentioned, posturing in the marketplace.
Yeah, so really two parts of that answer. If you look at the network as a service component, that's what we've built out over time. That's our global orchestration. That's, if you look at the first mile, middle mile, last mile, middle mile, I mentioned, we have our services POPs interconnected globally, where rock solid SLAs in terms of any packet loss, which is negligible, latency, jitter, other components to assure application performance on a global level. In fact, at the last mile now, we have what we call last mile services. And this has really been a major sticky point, especially for multinationals that have to deal with a plethora of ISPs out in the regions, where we take on that burden. We will do provisioning, we will do contracting, we will do monitoring and troubleshooting. It's becoming a very popular service for us. And then a lot of times people sometimes miss out on that multi-cloud component. How do I have optimized connectivity into the cloud? And that's where we have, from our facilities, where we have our services POPs into the various cloud platforms like AWS or Azure, Alibaba Cloud, Oracle, Google, and how we have the direct handoffs into the various SaaS applications. You can think of things like Salesforce, Microsoft 365, and others. And then taking a step back on what you said in terms of which is one a feature of the other, I think this is where people are getting caught up on semantics. And even the analysts that originally talk about SASE are saying, okay, some of you guys are getting it wrong, because the networking component is critical. And then the question is, do you lead only with a SASE offer and say, okay, I've buried SD-WAN into it? Or do I place the two as equals, so people understand there's the networking component and there's the SASE component? Based on our pedigree, we go with the latter approach, where we, of course, highlight what we're doing in the managed security space, but we don't want people to forget about what we've accomplished over time in the managed networking space. And in fact, even the analysts are now saying you have to look at the different buying centers. And if you go out with a message that says SASE, 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 and nothing else, you may be really disconnecting yourself from a buying center that's still very much networking focused. Of course, they're looking at bringing in security. And in fact, over half of our customer prospect engagements right now have a security component to them. Nevertheless, you still need to be able to highlight both pillars, the networking as a service and the networking security as a service.
Yeah, the managed service element's interesting too, because it's traditional WAN services. You had about a quarter to a third of buyers adopting this as a managed service. But in my last survey, I asked the question, what's your proclivity to use a managed service for SD-WAN and SASE? And it was over 2/3. And I think just what you mentioned about just the process of buying broadband alone can overwhelm a lot of larger companies. In fact, I read somewhere that there's over 800 broadband providers in the US. So it's, in theory, you could go from having one carrier relationship to hundreds, right? So if you're nationwide. So that's an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah,
Now,
and as just, not to interrupt, as a managed service, as I pointed out, we're shielding the
yeah,
enterprise from all of this complexity, from having to deal with the 800 broadband providers, from having to figure out what they need to do for their security manager, from having to nail up contract for individual cloud connectivity out in their various regions and geographies. That's the beauty of a managed service that everyone's beginning to understand more and more, is that we basically take on that burden, and the enterprise IT and the CIO and the CISO, they can work on more strategic imperatives, strategic initiatives, versus really just keeping the lights on, as we'd sometimes say.
yeah. Well, as a former network engineer, no one has fun managing carrier relationships. So
Yeah.
the fact that you do that, that's a good thing. Now, when you think about deployments today, I think if you roll back the clock a couple of years, when SASE was first getting off the ground, there was lots of businesses that had started the SD-WAN deployment, and then they looked at SASE as the thing they did after. And now with this big work from home trend, I'm sensing that a lot of customers are trying to jump right into SASE without doing anything with their WAN, to move to cloud-based security to address the needs of home workers and things. And so do you guys look at these as two distinct things? Are your customers trying to deploy one versus the other? Are they doing it at the same time? How should people think about, how to get started and what the deployment model might look like?
Sure. So there's two ways of looking at security. One is what you mentioned, the hybrid workforce. And so not to immediately dive into product and solution offerings, we do offer what we call private access, which is for remote worker connectivity. The beauty of that is, I talked a little bit earlier about our services POP architecture, that we can actually bring online these more advanced functionalities. And previously, we would connect in branches, headquarters sites, maybe on-prem data centers into our services POPs across the globe. It acts as that aggregation and control point, service delivery point before going across the middle mile. What our private access solution allows us to do is bring remote workers into the same services POPs. And what that gives you is really a hybrid architecture that delivers a lot of flexibility between on-prem and remote workers. Who knows, the month by month, given country, a given county, a given state, you may be in the office, you may be back in the office, who knows these days. And so you want an architecture that really fuses together this type of connectivity. And going back to your question, then we're seeing lots of customers now saying, okay, I have my branch office connectivity. As I'm considering changes, I'm considering my post-pandemic WAN architecture, I want to bring online this remote worker capability as well. The other part of that answer is that there are still multiple ways to deploy security, and they're not going to go away. And even most analysts say they're not going to go away. And what I mean by that is, sure, you've got the SASE architecture, delivered cloud edge, really optimized for people coming into the edge of the network and then over to SaaS applications, over to cloud platforms. That's one of the original reason of being of SASE, was to create a security architecture that was more optimized for a cloud-first environment. But the on-prem security is not going to go away. We have customers, and not only us, everyone else in the industry have customers that deploy physical firewalls, deploy on-prem virtual firewalls, either because of compliance reasons, because of connectivity reasons, scalability reasons. So what we see is a lot of enterprises are still embracing and will continue to embrace a hybrid security approach. And that doesn't necessarily say that they're not adopting SASE. It just means that they're adopting the best security posture, the best security architecture for a given point, for given user base, a given set of applications, a given type of topology. And we'll see that in the future as well.
Yeah, that the point you brought up about kind of not knowing what your workforce is going to look like is interesting, because I do think we're moving into an era where you have to be prepared to have everybody in the office, nobody in the office, and every possible combination in between. And that could change, literally on a week by week basis. And so that's certainly one of the big drivers for cloud-driven security. But what are some of the other higher order trends that you're seeing that are pushing companies towards this, more optimized cloud-driven security architecture? Because that's a big shift, in the way we've deployed security.
Sure. And so once again, think of it as the Aryaka perspective. We looked around, what are some of the trends out there? What are some of our lead enterprise customers telling us? Where do we try to read the tea leaves, if that's even possible right now? And so we've identified a couple of pillars that are sort of driving some of these decisions, driving some of these WAN transformational decisions. One, and we've talked about this already, the workloads that applications are shifting to the cloud, and that you need an architecture that's optimized for that, not only from the networking side, but from the security side. The second is the workforces. And as we mentioned, they're distributed. You need a security architecture that supports equally well people coming in from a traditional on-prem environment, as well as people coming in from remote. And then third, and this can't be overemphasized, it's shifting expectations in that people don't have much tolerance for a managed offer that's not performant. They don't have tolerance with finger pointing when they have a support issue. We talk about more of an Americanism, one throat to choke. The best way to say it is one hand to shake. But you need a service experience that wraps together the management of the networking and security into something that's very consumable, very optimized. And one way of looking at that, and we've heard people tell us this, is that it's like a SaaS-like experience. It's like a consumer-like managed service experience. And that's one of the things that we really hold as a foundation for Aryaka, that it's very different from, I want to say, a suboptimal experience that people have related when they work with traditional telcos, or in some cases, some of the managed service providers out there.
Yeah, that's the concept of moving to more of a consumption-based SaaS-like experience with security and cloud. Security and networking is relatively new to these industries, but the whole rest of IT has shifted that way.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at what Dell and HP and companies like that are doing in the compute and storage side, it's commonplace, right? And it's for whatever reason, networking and security we've kind of lagged that way, probably just because of the complexity of change and things like that. But clearly, I think considering the rest of IT's moved that way, it makes sense that we'd want to move networking and security that way. I also think, and I also think there's just a broader trend around distributed resources, right? So we're moving into a world that's becoming more dynamic and more distributed, and so if our IT architecture doesn't change, then we can't keep up, which is what's driven that cloud change. And so if you just think of it from an IT perspective, if your workforce is becoming more dynamic and more distributed, and you're doing things in the area of networking and security that doesn't support that, you're actually going backwards, right? And it becomes harder and harder. So,
yeah, another sort of a side point on that. Once again, not to slog four-letter acronyms around, but we're all familiar with MPLS. We'll show our age, and both of us were in networking at the dawn of MPLS 20 years ago now. And what we're seeing is that as people look at, okay, how do I re-engineer the WAN? What do I need for additional bandwidth from the branches and the headquarters sites going into my cloud properties, going into the SaaS application, being able to support a true hybrid environment where video is not the exception anymore, but it's 24/7. How do I support hybrid remote workers that are coming in over the internet? And one of the things we've seen as a drop-off even more apparent than anyone would have expected even 12 months ago is the transformation of contracts from MPLS to internet access, and in some cases like Aryaka, a dedicated middle mile architecture. But it's just really interesting how quickly enterprises seem to be transitioning from more legacy connectivity and transport services to something that's more internet driven, internet flexibility that actually allows them to better support this distributed and cloud-based application environment.
Yeah, so based on the trends that you went through, that highlights, I think, a lot of the limitations of the current approaches. So can you talk about what some of those are?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting. It was a good segue. If I just go back to what I was explaining a couple minutes ago, a lot of existing approaches, I want to say legacy architectures, are based on a hub and spoke architecture, where the assumption was that all these people would come back to headquarter sites and then being handed off to the internet. Obviously, that sufficed well over the decades, but in a cloud-first application environment, that's not going to work. It's more of a mesh. And that was one of the foundations for looking at a security architecture that could support this mesh, therefore SASE. But and then if you look at some of the trends that I talked about workforces, about application environment, about the services environment, you need to be able to, one, support a consistent environment support consistent application experience in a very dynamic environment, moving from on-prem to remote. We sometimes describe this as making your remote workers first-class citizens of the enterprise network. The second is because they're now remote, because you've got whole verticals, whole user types that were never remote before, and you've really extended the enterprise security perimeter out. That obviously introduces risk, it introduces opportunity, but you need to really have a security architecture that now supports this pervasive security across distributed users, device, apps. And then finally, once again, as I mentioned, a premier services and support experience. You want to make sure you have the workflows. You want to make sure you have the operational expertise and experience. You want to make sure you have the provisioning capabilities to be able to support this new, very dynamic environment. I was just going to sort of, not really pontificating, but add additional point in supporting remote workers. One of the things we're beginning to entertain a lot of conversations on, and we also see this externally, is how do I best support these home office workers? In the past, say myself as a case study, I would work Fridays at home. I would have an adequate home office experience, not funded by the enterprise. I'd have my consumer broadband, and through the pandemic, I'd be contesting with my wife and my two daughters that were remote learning. And so coming out of this, we're seeing enterprises really opening up their eyes and talking about the fundamental reallocation of some of their budgets from something more on-prem. And that also includes office space, as some of the contracts, some of the leases expire, to more of a willingness going forward of funding the home office, because a lot of people are talking about, myself included, a 3+2, which is 3 days in the office, 2 days outside of the office. To really make that viable, I need a hardened home office experience. I don't want consumer broadband anymore. I want a business broadband service. I want just a better home working setup where I can be assured that I will be as effective those 2 days when I'm remote as those 3 days when I'm in the office. So we're in some interesting times in how enterprises are going to be allocating their networking, connectivity, and security budgets going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about making remote workers first-class citizens. They better be, since that's going to be the majority of workers for a lot of companies, right? So, in fact, if not some, all. But thanks for highlighting those challenges. And so how do you see our security and network architectures evolving then to meet those challenges? You touched on it a little bit with hardened broadband and hardened security, but are there other things? Sure.
A couple things. One, from the networking side, if you look at, I'm say in a branch, I want to have, or headquarters site, I want to have additional almost automated flexibility between, if I identify applications, identify services that I want to go over a premium connection, remembering that under SD-WAN, really the last mile is a business internet service. And many times it's deployed in a resilient configuration. But for the middle mile, I want to be able to say, okay, I've got certain locations, certain destinations that I want to have a premium service. In the past, that would be MPLS, or using, in our case, the Aryaka middle mile. But in the same way, I want to be able to use internet connectivity where it's appropriate, either the types of applications, the types of performance I need, what geographies I'm in. That's the networking side. I also need to make sure that I've got this nailed up multi-cloud connectivity. The acronym Software-Defined Cloud Interconnect is becoming more and more understood, where you have an automated programmable environment distributed out in the regions that allow your customers, and this is either remote workers or on-prem workers, being able to come across your managed service offering and then hand off in the most effective way to any one of a number of cloud platforms or any one of the number of SaaS applications, versus the enterprise having to be responsible on their own to create all these contracts and to nail up, all this interconnect. On the security side, in the same way, you want to be able to have an architecture, and this goes back to when I was talking about private access, where both on-prem workers and remote workers are coming to a converged services POP that actually not only delivers that remote access connectivity, but also provides a consolidation point for orchestration, for policy management, for observability. And that ensures that the security posture that I have created for my on-prem environment over the decades now, I have the same type of controls. I have the same security posture, the same type of control over my threat perimeter for my remote workers. And that's been a lot of, if you look back over the last year, that's a lot of work that's been done of late, where maybe there were some band-aids, as you call it, in the early months going back into 2020. Now a lot of enterprises are revisiting, what did I do? What are the best practices, and how do I harden this as a go forward architecture?
Yeah, so let's shift gears a bit here into Aryaka land.
Sure.
You talked a lot about the challenges. You talked a lot about kind of the differences in architectures. What are you guys doing specifically to meet some of these?
Sure. One of the things, going back to what I mentioned about services POPs, and that's really one of the crown jewels of the architectures, where we have these out in all of the various metropolitan areas. It's interconnected by dedicated L2 over fiber, so we control that infrastructure. There's no ISP peering. It's not at layer 3. It's really, it delivers equal or better performance at a much more aggressive price point than MPLS. And what the services POP allow us to do is deploy a lot of really value-added services pointing to the edge of the network, because our POPs don't only have routing and switching, they have compute and storage. What that's allowed us to do over the last decade or so is deploy very, very sophisticated network and application optimization, a close handshake between the POP and the managed CPE, the cloud managed CPE, which we deploy on-prem. Now, where we've evolved that over the last 12 months is to add what I talked about as our private access capabilities, where we deploy the client out at the remote workers, but we aggregate them all on our services POP. I sometimes jokingly call it a virtual VPN concentrator, because we're running that aggregation code as containerized instances on our services POPs before handing off these remote workers into the core. And the same way going forward, we're using our services POP as the foundation to deploy SASE capabilities, things like SWIGs and managed firewalls as a service and others. And this, going back to the compute and storage, it's really an idealized architecture that allows us to deploy SASE. And going back to earlier in our conversation, the whole idea of networking versus security, all of that experience we've built up over time in delivering a managed networking service globally. It's very, I'm not going to say it's very easy, but it's very straightforward. It's not an unknown for us to now bring up additional edge-facing security capabilities. The last part is going back to the overall customer support experience, realizing, and I may have pointed this out, but not in enough detail, we develop our own technology, and we only offer our technology as part of our own managed service. We do not bring in other technology, except in some cases with some of our security partnerships. Because, for example, we have enterprise customers that might be working with Palo Alto or Checkpoint, and they want to continue those relationships. We need to give them optionality in terms of what type of security posture they want to deploy going forward. But if I look at what we've been able to do on the security side, what we've been able to do on the managed services side, because we don't have any handoffs, we control the engineering roadmap. We understand our own technology as better as anyone in the world. We can offer a support experience that's really unparalleled in the industry, and our customers tell us that. We get kudos from Tech Validate, who a lot of people are familiar with. To bring up an analyst firm, Gartner Peer Insights, Voice of the Customer, WAN Edge. We're the only managed service provider there, and that speaks to what we've been able to accomplish on the service and support side. And so when we talk about this whole managed offer, a good way to look at it is three different pillars or three different parts of legs of a stool. One being the networking component, the other being the security component, and the third being the lifecycle management, the lifecycle customer experience and workflows component that ties all of this together into an integrated managed service offering.
Well, thanks, Dave. That was a good overview of your product. That's all I had for questions, but I did want to say something to the audience if you're watching this. When you're buying technology, it's often easy to make the decision to stick with your incumbent. It's the easy thing to do. But at times of market transitions, it's very important you do your homework. And in this space in particular, SD-WAN and SASE, there are so many vendors. I think it's extremely important that companies actually do their due diligence, evaluate all the vendors, and take a look at things. I think the integrated stack that you built actually does have a lot of benefits. I think more and more CISOs that I've talked to now understand that you don't have to have best of breed everywhere to have best in class threat protection. In fact, you could argue that trying to do best of breed everywhere actually gives you subpar threat protection, right? So that's just one small example of where that kind of integrated stack actually makes a big difference. So Dave Ginsburg from Aryaka, unless you have any other closing comments, I want to thank you for joining.
Sure. And I wanted to try to tie together what you just said and some of the other points I was making. And once again, playing back what we hear from our customers. One, what we're able to do in ensure higher productivity on a global basis for their employees. Obviously, productivity turns into profitability. Yeah. And the second, because of what we're able to do with this fused architecture, delivering the operational simplicity in a very secure way to our enterprise customers. And then finally, I go back to the support experience, the workflows, how we actually engineer this on a global level, what we're able to deliver in terms of extreme agility and ultimately lower total cost of ownership. And so those are some of the benefits that we're able to easily communicate into our customer base and into our prospects.
All right. Well, Dave, thanks for joining me. I've been very impressed with what you guys have done over the last decade or so, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's coming next from Aryaka.
Thank you, Zeus. It's always great chatting with you.
Yeah, so on behalf of Dave, I'm Zeus Caravallis saying thanks for watching us on Zcast, and don't forget to click to subscribe.